some shame. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Enter, rejoice, and come in. Today will be a joyful day. Enter, rejoice, and come in.
Please join me in our chalice lighting words. We gather this hour
As people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs,
we light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
We all know what it feels like to be sad or mad or glad or a cad or very, very bad, right? Similarly, we all know what it feels like to be creative. Now, some of you may balk at that, but it's true for all of us. Mainly because when we are creative, we are most human. And I like, in particular, this definition of what it means to be creative. It means that when we are producing something both novel and useful in a particular social setting, that constitutes something that we are being creative with. We can experience, I think, when that happens, kind of that magical combination of being relevant and unique and playful and productive, and every now and then kind of transcendent as well. And this is true, really, regardless of what we are creating, whether that is a short story or an Excel sheet, a painting or a PowerPoint, a garden or an algorithm, a new advertising campaign, a new curriculum, or that new idea for ice cream that nobody else has ever tried. The Unitarian process theologian Henry Nelson Wyman understood this power of creativity and even went on to associate it with the experience of the divine. Wyman defined God as a process, not as a persona, an experience, not an entity. God happens to us and between us, he said. It is a verb more than a noun. And every time that we engage each other with ideas in a way that creates something new, we are experiencing God, experiencing the divine. God, he said, is the thing that drives us to interact creatively. And God is the urge to bump into each other and new ideas. In fact, he would say that God is the new idea, the new feeling, the new insight, the relationship, the creation. This experience of creation, he believed, was what we as human beings are actually built for. Now, given the fact that the creative impulse is both sacred and magical, it's a little confounding why we don't seek it out more and why we don't conjure up reasons, how we often do, to not be creative. So my hope is today, actually, that we can explore some ways to kind of pull that creative process closer into us, that impulse to reach into the creative world and make it more accessible and regular for all of us. Because this creative interchange, as Wyman called it, is truly one of the greatest blessings life has to offer any of us. I think many of us would agree that one of the primary reasons we get tripped up around creativity or thinking of ourselves as creative has to do with fear and judgment. We may have had an elementary school teacher who told us that we could not draw. We may have had an English high school teacher who told us there wasn't a creative bone in our body. Or maybe even a counselor who told us we couldn't act to save our life. The world of art and critique are often really quite closely put together. When you think of any film that comes out, there's always critics that are writing about the film, right? That's why you go to Rotten Tomatoes to figure out whether or not it's worth going to or not. When a book comes out, when a new theater company has a new play that comes out, when a dance company has something that comes out, they all have reviews based on what it is, that very vulnerable creative act that's put in front of everybody. My undergrad's in art, and I had about 70 studio art credits, and I can't remember a time where you didn't finish an assignment and put your work out in front of everybody, and everybody stood around and did kind of this, and looks at your work and does the critical eye on it. Very few people said, "Wow, that's awesome," right? You know, it often came down to like nitpicking on certain things as you went along. It was a very humbling experience often. And it seems to me we've all had that experience somehow, somewhere along in our life. It may have come from a family member, it may have come from a teacher or friends or coworkers. On top of the judgment worry from other people, we can go to the opposite extreme of internal or self-judgment. And we may misunderstand that co-creation with the divine not as a means to share the human experience, but instead a product that ensures love and appreciation from others, a legacy after we're gone, prestige from our peers, a means to shore up our worth, the one thing that will validate to the world that we matter. And yet, thinking of creativity in that way, to think of it as a way to impress. 2 weeks ago, the beloved comedian Gary Shandling died at the age of 66. And Gary was famously known in the comedic world as being both kind and compassionate, which normally you wouldn't really think of comedians as having those two elements to them, right? The Guardian, the British newspaper, did a great kind of requiem of his life and shorted up in giving examples of who Gary was. And one of the examples that they gave was talking about the fact that Jerry Seinfeld now has a new show on the web that's called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. Come on, that's awesome, don't you think? I mean, really. So anyway, there are these short pieces that he has on the web, and right in January of this last year, Gary Shandling was on with Jerry Seinfeld. And this particular kind of episode is this portrait of like friendship and affection. And, you know, again, the kind that in particular you wouldn't necessarily assign to somebody like Jerry Seinfeld, right? So it starts off, and Gary says to Jerry, "I love you," and they give each other a hug, and Jerry says the same thing back to Gary, and then they're driving around in this Porsche, and they're stopping at old haunts, and they're having a great time telling jokes to each other. And then at one point, Seinfeld mentions the comic David Brenner. And he says, David Brenner passed away last year. And do you ever think about, like, all that material? And Shandling laughs, and he's like, you know, I'm at a stage in my life where I actually care about the person, he says. And Seinfeld, though, he won't let it go. And he says, all that material, you work so hard on it. It's just gone. It doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. And Shandling says, that material, your material, is purely a way for you to express your spirit and your soul and your being. And Seinfeld says, it doesn't have any value beyond that? And Shandling says, it doesn't have any value beyond you expressing yourself spiritually in a very soulful way. And Shandling laughs, and then he says, Jerry, it's why you're on the planet. Hear, hear. It's why you're on the planet. The creative endeavor, as Shandling says to Jerry, has no value beyond you expressing yourself spiritually in a very soulful way. It's about expressing yourself, not impressing others. And I love that. If we look at creativity in such a manner, we would indeed let go of the need to leave a legacy or to garner prestige or to validate our worth. We would let go of judgment from the self and from others because they are irrelevant, really, to that way of thinking about creativity. And the truth and the lesson that Shandling offers is so brilliant and it's so simple. Creativity, our creativity, is experienced for our well-being, period. It is there to express, not impress. That's guidepost number 1. You got that? Ready? Impress. No, wait a minute, I even got it wrong. Oh my God. Okay, wait a minute. Express, not impress. Okay, we're going to do it one more time so Kaaren remembers it. Express, not impress. Bingo, thank you. So many of my artist friends have taught me another thing that keeps creativity kind of just out of our reach is our belief that creativity is something that we are. Now, on first blush, I don't think it's really that problematic to think about it that way, as in creativity is something we have or we are. But when you put it through like the process of what happens to all of us, I actually think it is problematic. And here I'm going to turn to the ancients to explain why. The ancient Greeks and the Romans didn't believe that creativity came from human beings. They believed that creativity was a separate divine attendant that came to human beings from some distant and unknowable source for a distant and unknowable reason. The Greeks famously called these divine spirits of creativity daemons. Socrates believed that his daemon spoke to him far all the time. Now, the Romans had the same idea for that kind of creative piece outside of themselves, but they called it their genius, a genius. And the Romans did not believe that a particular clever person was a genius. They believed that in these cases, a genius literally like lived in the walls of a studio, of an art studio, or in a bakery. And they would come out to assist the baker or the artist when they needed it, help shape that outcome of the work, kind of like Dobby, the house elf in Harry Potter, right? Which is pretty cool. Mainly because it gave artists, those who create, which means all of us, a psychological construct to protect themselves from the results of their work. So one author comments on this way of thinking about it, and I love how she says this. She says, if your work was brilliant, you couldn't take credit for it all. Everybody knew that you had this disembodied genius who had helped you. Likewise, if your work kind of bombed, it wasn't entirely your fault. At that time, your genius was being kind of lame. How cool would that be? This is how people actually thought about creativity all the way until the Renaissance. And then the Renaissance actually changed everything around, and primarily because when the Renaissance came about, we put the individual human at the center of the universe above all gods and mysteries. It was the introduction of rational humanism. So there wasn't room for such like mystical otherness. And for the first time in history, at least in the West, you heard people refer to an artist as being a genius rather than having a genius. And perhaps in that change, there was a really big error in that whole piece. It's a little hard to have one person, one little tiny human being, be the vessel, the essence, the source of all divine, creative, unknowable, eternal mystery. That's a lot for the human psyche to like hold on to. And when the creative inspiration does not embody a creative person, when it seems on strike or goes on a long vacation, and that maddening, somewhat capricious nature of the creative process is elusive, then there can be a lot of damning of self, of one's talent and spirit and guts and faith, and you feel like you're lost in the wilderness a little bit. There's a poet, Ruth Stone, who died a couple of years ago, but she tells the story of growing up in rural Virginia. And she'd be out working in the fields, and she said she would feel and hear a poem come to her over the landscape. And she said it would kind of like come in this thunderous feeling to her, and the earth would shake below her feet. And she said at that point, the only thing that she could do was run like hell to the house, which is what she said. She ran like hell to the house to grab a piece of paper and a pencil so that when that poem came and it thundered through her, she could write it down. Now, there were times, she said, that she was running, and she didn't get to the piece of paper and the pencil, and that poem like came like that, and she lost all of it. And at that point, she said, the poem would go on over the horizon for another poet to take it up. And then there were these times, how she explains it, that she'd run to the house, the poem's coming at her, it kind of goes through her, the paper and pencil is right there, she grabs it with one hand, but the poem's already falling out of her, so she grabs the poem and she pulls it back into herself by the tail, she says, and she'd pull and she'd pull and she'd write and she'd write. And in those instances, the poem would come up on the page perfect and intact, but backwards, from the last word to the first. Wouldn't you have loved to have met that woman? Elizabeth Gilbert, the long-standing New York Times bestseller, Eat, Pray, Love, talks about that poet's kind of description of that creative process that happens to her. And she says, that isn't my process. I'm not the pipeline. I'm a mule. And the way that I work is I have to get up at the same time every day, and I sweat and I label and I barrel through, and it's really awkward. But even my mulishness, she says, even I have brushed up against that thing at times, ideas that come through me from a source that I honestly can't identify. And what is that thing? How do you relate to it in a way that not make us lose our minds, but in fact might actually keep us sane? Keeping sane with the version we have now of self-criticism and betrayal of our creative selves is oppressive and dangerous. It's hurtful to your soul. So I was so intrigued when I read this piece it was an interview with Tom Waits. You know Tom Waits, the musician and songwriter. And he was talking about actually somewhat of this process. And he tells the story of being in his car in LA. Now, if you know Tom Waits' work and how he worked before, he was kind of the embodiment of the tortured contemporary modern artist, trying to control and manage and dominate these sort of uncontrollable creative impulses that were totally internalized for him. And then he got older and calmer. So he says he's out on the highway in LA, and while he's driving, he hears this little fragment of a melody that comes to him. And into his head, as inspiration often does, right? It's elusive and tantalizing, and he wants it, and it's gorgeous, and he longs for it. But there he's driving. He has no piece of paper or a pencil or a tape recorder. And he starts to feel that old anxiety come over him. And he says, like, I'm going to lose this thing and it's going to haunt me forever. I'm not good enough and I can't do it. The self-doubt kept coming up for him. And then he said, instead of panicking, he tried something completely novel. And he took a deep breath and he looked out the window up to the sky and he said, "Excuse me, can you not see that I'm driving right now? Can you not see that I don't have the ability to write a song down right now? Really, if you really want to exist, come back at a more opportune time so I can take care of you. If not, move on to someone else. Go bother Leonard Cohen." And this whole kind of work process changed, he said, after that. Not the work was still oftentimes as dark as it always has been, but the process and that heavy anxiety around it was released when he took the genie, the genius out of him, where it was causing nothing but trouble, and released it back to where it had come from, and realized that this didn't have to be this internalized, tormented thing. It could be this peculiar, kind of wondrous, bizarre collaboration, a kind of conversation between Tom and the strange external thing that was not quite Tom. I adore that story. I am much saner. That's saying a lot, by the way. I am much saner. Lynn's like, yeah. When I think of my muse not in me, but a brush with something that I really can't explain. When conditions are right, I think of the process as being in an expansive Midwest field with clover and the sun is kind of setting and these fireflies come out as inspiration and new ideas. And when the conditions are great, I have my ball jar open and I put those suckers in there all the time, right? And I have this wonderful feeling of I'm full. I've got everything that I need. And then there are times, though, that I'm in that field and they're not coming as easily. And I have learned that I have to trust that it will come if I just release my anxiety to it a little bit more. And sure enough, some of those fireflies will show up. Every now and then, when I really, really, really need to have faith, I've got to just settle into the whole piece that it will come somehow. Every now and then by the skin of my teeth, but I make it with something that kind of brings insight and creativity to what it is that I'm working on. And I have found that this method not only helps keep me sane, but it also gives me more freedom to let go and let God. Now, I know for sure that sounds very strange coming from this atheist minister, but I mean it as simply being open to the creative impulse that any creation I create is not totally of my own doing. Someone once asked me why I don't have that many of my original drawings. I've either sold them or I give them away. And I have found that I do it as a spiritual discipline, actually, as a reminder that the creative impulse is always available to me if I can trust that it's not really going to wander away that far. I am free from my own kind of self-tormenting worry and judgment and fear. And when I can have faith in my fireflies, I do indeed usher in beauty into my life. And I am connected to something that keeps me grounded and whole and often duly joyful. Henry Nelson Wyman, our UU theologian, did not speak of God with a will, intentionality, or a consciousness, but rather as a creative exchange, an impulse to share that which is most deeply human with others. Again, whether that is a short story or an Excel sheet, a painting or a PowerPoint, a garden or an algorithm, a new advertising campaign, a new curriculum, a new take on grandmother's mac and cheese that only you are coming up with. All of those creative endeavors. There are times you can have that transcendent moment. And it may be fleeting, sometimes it may be lengthy, but it always kind of moves to a different place. So friends, during this month of creation, may we heed Gary Shandling's wisdom to express, not impress. And the ancients believed that the creative impulse is ours to interact with as friend and external muse. I do believe that if we took on those kind of tidbits of wisdom, our learned theologian Wyman, if he were still alive and he were sitting, would be here with a big smile on his face, and he'd pass all of you a pencil and say, get to it. Explore, have faith, unite with that which makes you whole and alive. Carpe diem to all, and to all a good night. Amen.
Take a hand. Let no one stand alone. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Amen. He's with Marcus. Yeah. I brought him.
Do you want to, Ted, do you mind just putting it?
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.